And this principle, we alluded to last time, is the principle of the psychic center or the psychic being or the soul, which comes into the picture. This is a puzzle that, for example, Carl Jung was struggling with most of his life, and he finally settled on this idea that the soul is needed to balance out the outer personality. I use an analogy, which is a little bit funny, but if you think of it, you know, remember these old taxis where you had a passenger compartment in the back and you had a driver compartment in the front with the glass window between the two, right? And the passenger, if you think of it as the soul, which is, you know, the
Ah,
conscious agent that knows where it wants to go, you know, gets in the taxi, knows where it wants to go. The driver is the ego, is the organization principle, is the instrumental principle. And it knows how to drive, it knows the city, and it doesn't have any particular purpose until the passenger comes in. It says, I want to go to that X location. And therefore, a purpose is developed. And therefore, that communication
nice
allows,
metaphor, yeah.
yeah, the communication allows the purpose to be fulfilled through the instrumentation.
So the last time we went through the parts and planes, and we described what's the soul,
Yeah,
discussed with the innermost and the outer and inner being, and so on.
yes,
And in your long list, but very interesting list, I see that then there is the second part that is about the transformation in general.
yes.
There's a beginning of the transformation of the ego, which is quite interesting because I don't remember Sri Aurobindo speaking much about the transformation of the ego, but perhaps he does, but it was not that self-evident. The purpose of transformation, then psychic transformation, of course, spiritual and supramental transformation, evolution of consciousness. Maybe we have already a bit discussed about the evolution, but we can eventually also begin with that, because I think the principle of transformation makes much more sense in the global view of the evolution of consciousness.
Mhm.
Then the journey from unconscious to superconsciousness, instinct, unhealthy ego development, the problem of spiritual bypassing, integration of personality, wholeness, our many selves or sub-personalities. Yeah, that's interesting. Integration of personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal aspects of life experiences. Yeah, I would like to know then the difference.
Yeah.
And the journey from fragmentation to wholeness. It's just an appetizer to begin with. You have not necessarily to go through this
Yeah. No, I think these topics are really they overlap quite a bit actually.
yeah.
They're not as separate as it might seem like. But it is a continuation of what we talked about last week, and with focus on practical applications and or utility of, you know, in a sense, why, you know, why integral psychology is important, you know, in what way does it help us and so on. So yeah, these are these are all different things. So I'm not sure if I'll be separating them out so much,
No.
but I think transformation is a good topic. So
Yeah. So perhaps let's begin with, that's my curiosity. What is meant exactly by the transformation of the ego? Because I have an understanding what the transformation of the mind is, the transformation of the vital, the psychic transformation, spiritual transformation, what do you mean exactly with transformation of the ego?
Yes, yes, yeah. Um, so if you recall, it's important to remember that the definition of ego, as we discussed last time, and if you recall, I called it a principle of organization,
Yeah.
and at the same time, I called it a principle of embodiment, right? So the ego becomes uh, the principle of organization of the embodied being. So that's basically uh, the functional definition of ego. What is ego good for? What does it do? It's separate from the idea of ego being a separation principle, like being in a bubble apart from everything else, or as an obstruction to spiritual practice, because yes, it could be like that in a certain sense, especially if the ego formation is not healthy and there's
This
clinical
is the
work
same of
needed.
personality.
Well, the ego is part of personality,
Okay.
right? It's an aspect of personality. A
Hmm.
number of different personality theories in the West have often included the ego as an important part of it. There's no need to go into all of that, but for example, Freud, introduced the idea, and then Jung had his own take on it. Assagioli had his own take on it. I think I went over these very briefly last time, so not to repeat that so much. But the ego is always very central to a personality theory. So basically, what we're talking about here in terms of transformation is transformation of this embodied being or this embodied principle of organization. The suggestion here is that there's something about the way that this ego functions that even though it's natural and we need it to, develop, to grow, but uh, there's also a point where it becomes a problem. Uh, both it could be clinical issues, problems of adaptation in life. If the ego uh, structure as part of the overall personality structure um, is not very healthy, then it can cause even ordinary issues in day-to-day living, basic psychology, basic
Yeah.
clinical
Yeah.
psychology issues, right? But also in terms of this psycho-spiritual development, there will be issues that comes up, So it's important to have a relatively normal functional ego structure before we can embark on this spiritual journey, And so this is a point that I do like to stress a lot because not everybody often stresses this point. There may be an assumption that, well, we can work with any ego, we can work with any ego in any condition and we can transform it. That may or may not be possible. Sometimes with the help of a guru, or under specific conditions, it might be possible to work with an ego that's not very healthy and functional in day-to-day life. But oftentimes, what happens is because our ego is our lens to reality. The ego is often how we organize reality, and so our ego is our lens to the reality that we see. So how our ego is formed determines how we see reality. For example, if we say somebody is very narcissistic, or has strong narcissistic traits, that
Mm.
basically means that they're very self-absorbed. They're very self-concerned. They often think about themselves and are concerned with their own issues. So you can see that in their what they talk about and what they're interested in, and so this self-preoccupation is something that is a quality of an ego that has these narcissistic traits. And so the lens onto the reality is such that there's so much emphasis on oneself, but not necessarily a good understanding of others. So a narcissist, for example, we say is not very empathic because they're not able to put themselves in other people's place and be able to feel or understand their experiences because they're so self-absorbed that this other person is more like an instrument of their thinking process rather than a whole separate being that they need to pay attention to in their own terms, you know. So that's the reality then, you know. So that's you know, the kind of problem that arises because it is our lens or our window to reality. So our basic reality needs to be relatively healthy. And so
Yeah.
in integral yoga, uh, it has come to the point where with integral psychology, we I think we could say generally today that integral counseling psychology is a process where there's attention paid both to development of the ego and personality on a sort of more or less normal level, at the same time preparing it for psychospiritual development, something that goes beyond the ordinary development. So I think in that sense, we can talk about the ego as being something that needs to be transformed. Now, to answer your question, uh, you may also recall that we said that this structure is not just a simple structure. There's no one thing called the ego. There's
Yeah.
actually at least three different levels of this that you can see in Sri Aurobindo's writings. You know, for example, there's a physical ego, there's
Mm. Yeah.
a vital ego, and there's a
Mm.
mental ego. And last time we talked about how in the developmental process, the physical ego develops in the first couple of years of life during the so-called psychomotor period, where you know the body is just developing and the brain is developing. And so during that process, the body needs to be, as a foundation, needs to be established. And then the principle of volition comes in, the energetic principle, the idea of intentionality of consciousness, the directing of one's energy, as well as an understanding that one has the agency, the capability to direct this energy. So this is the vital development, which is also connected with the world of emotions, you know, and this goes on for a couple of years, you know, and until you know, we have also this overlapping process here. Of course, it's not just physical and then vital, it's all really very much
Yeah.
overlapping. But at the same time, you go through the ego, mental ego development, which is when the brain is ready to conceptualize, to hold images of oneself and hold self-image and self-concept and things of that sort, which are discussed in Western psychology quite a bit. So during this process, the triple ego formation, physical, vital, mental, uh, grows to a kind of a sort of a natural point of, one might say, a process of not a perfect balance between these three centers. These three centers are not necessarily very harmonious. In some people, the physical ego is a stronger principle. And in some people, the vital ego is a stronger principle. And in some people, the mental ego.
Yeah.
So these lead to different personality types. I think we mentioned also this, that, for example, you know, we have in Indian psychology, we have the tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic, right? The three gunas. So tamasic is equated with the physical, with inertia, with density. And rajasic is equated with vital, with energy. And sattvic is the balance between the two, which comes about with the development of the mental faculties that can try to harmonize these two other centers. But this harmony is never really achieved in the outer being because there's always a struggle between these centers. Everyone has a formation at these three different levels, but in some people, one is stronger than the other. But everybody has a profile of one or two being stronger than a third, or one being stronger than the other two. So there's always a triangle of sorts going on. But you know, just as a triangle in geometry is a has infinite number of shapes. That's something peculiar about a triangle as opposed to, let's say, a square, right? A square has only one shape, but it can have many different sizes. But a triangle can have infinite number of possibilities depending on the angles that you choose.
Okay.
So a triangle is very hard to balance
Mhm.
without an additional principle. And this principle, we alluded to last time, is the principle of the psychic center or the psychic being or the soul, which comes into the picture. This is a puzzle that, for example, Carl Jung was struggling with most of his life, and he finally settled on this idea that the soul is needed to um, balance out the outer personality. He called outer personality the persona, and so and he had these psychological types, for example, the sensate and the feeling type and the thinking type, that are very much correlates of what we just talked about. So these personality types, they need to be balanced out somehow. And the ego is a new principle that comes into the picture. I'm sorry, that I meant the soul is a principle that comes into the picture to balance these three things out. So in a way, I'm answering your question by saying by transformation of the ego, we really need to transform it at all these different levels. But oftentimes, as Geraldine and the mother have also mentioned this in many different places, I think the transformation is easier on the mental level, and
Mm.
it's a little harder on the vital emotional level, and it's the
Mm.
hardest at the physical level. So it's almost inconceivable that one could start a transformation process at the very sort of bottom of our physical being. It has to start from the top. So a descent of a higher consciousness
Mm.
can help the transformation first of the mental and then of the vital. Even the vital itself is quite a challenge. One might say that the majority of human beings right now, in the course of current evolution, are really struggling with the vital issues and vital transformation. And Cherubin has also pointed this out because the vital is this principle of utilization of energy and application of willpower. And so it's a strong tendency, and it has a strong resistance and strong defense mechanisms that are associated with that. So we have these ideas basically out there on the table here. And so I would like to maybe step back and say, why is transformation of personality important?
Yeah.
Uh, Before we go into integral yoga, let me just give you just a very brief background about this idea in Western psychology. In the research that started after the Second World War, which was, in a sense, the beginning of formal modern clinical psychology research, one of the earlier topics that were dealt with was change of personality. I mean, the research question often was, can you change someone's personality? And in the late 50s and 60s, these kinds of questions were quite popular. But then somehow it turned out that no, it's not that easy, and this topic sort of fell off. Later on, there's also a parallel development called trait psychology. Gordon Allport from England was the person who started that. He talked about personality not being a kind of a map, such as Freud's or Jung's, where there's some kind of a topography. There are different elements of this topography, like the unconscious and superconscious and things of that sort. But he talked about trait psychology, traits being qualities that exist universally, but different human beings have a different combination of these qualities in that aggregate together and contribute to what we call their personality. So the idea of a personality profile was the idea of looking at these traits and see, how people score on these different, traits. There are actually well over three or even maybe 400 traits that are, established, all kinds of attributes and qualities and so on. It's a long list. but the idea would be to create a profile, you know. This is actually a very interesting approach. And some later, more recent research has shown that some traits do change over time. And like, for example, people become naturally less selfish as they grow, as they get older. You know, that's something
Mm.
that helps naturally. Not in everybody, not to the
Yeah.
same extent, but this is something that you can see in most people. That makes sense, you know, when we're a child, you know, we're preoccupied with our own development and our own worldview. But when we grow up, we begin to absorb other worldviews and become aware of other realities. So there's an exchange there between the personal and the interpersonal there. So we tend to go more in the interpersonal dimension and master that more. But you know, there may be a few other things that now they say is possible to transform maybe over time. But I think you can say that generally the idea of change of personality or transformation of personality is not something that is a big topic in mainstream Western psychology. It did come about with the rise of transpersonal psychology. Of course, transpersonal psychology started with Carl Jung and Roberta Assagioli in Europe in the 1930s and onward. And then in the United States in the mid 1960s, there was a American sort of wave of that came about. And they will basically they were aware of Eastern teachings, starting with Jung, you know, and Assagioli. So the idea of the influence of Eastern teachings, especially Indian teachings or Taoism, for example, really started to plant the seeds of the idea of transformation of personality or spiritual transformation, loosely defined. So
Mm.
this topic came in. And I remember, you know, I mean, for decades now, I've been hearing this topic of transformation in transpersonal psychology circles. You know, it's
Mm.
just a buzzword, you know, and it's really, you know, something that it looks like everybody's looking for that, you know, and it makes sense, you know. We need to change to become a spiritual being, you know, from our current state, whatever, however you define that we need to sort of go beyond this in some sense. So this change or transformation is a key word. But I hardly ever saw uh, a lot of discussion or readings that told us how does transformation actually take place. You know, it's just one of those mysteries, you know, that everybody likes to talk about, but there's not a lot of clarity about how that's possible. Of course, Jung and Assagioli, as I mentioned before as well, are the two early transpersonal psychologists that remain very compatible with integral psychology today
Mm.
because not only they brought the idea of soul into the picture, they also had their own definitions of ego. And then the idea of how to balance the soul and the ego, the idea of, you know, sort of the reconciliation of these two centers, ego being the outer being center and soul being the inner being center, right? So there had to be some kind of a, you know, reconciliation of the two. And so for them, the idea of, for example, transforming the ego by incorporating the unconscious materials to some extent or as much as possible into the field of ego, which is generally known as a conscious principle, such as Jung defined it. So transformation would be something like if I have certain unconscious elements through certain practices or experiences, I may be able to shed light on them and bring them into the field of consciousness and therefore, you know, incorporate them into my field of consciousness. So how can that be done? Well, it can be done in different ways. For example, using dreams, right? You
Mm.
know, working with
Mm.
dreams would be something that the material that one experiences during the dream stage of sleep is something that can be worked with. And, you know, because we're not conscious in the ordinary sense
Mm.
of egoic, normal day-to-day sense during sleep. But when we're awake, we can actually try to recall and access that material and work with it and somehow incorporate it by interpretation of it or working with it in different ways, right? There are also a lot of new therapies that have come about that, and this started with Jung, that utilize artwork as a way of accessing the unconscious. There are other methods such as writing, writing, creative writing, or other artistic processes or creative processes in general that can help us get in touch with material that is normally not conscious, and we can incorporate that. So the idea for Jung, for example, was we can make this ego more conscious, and there will be transformations, changes because of that. Jung, however, did not think that a complete transformation or becoming the ego completely conscious was possible. I believe partly the reason for that was that um, he thought of the psychic energy as something close to the idea of libidinal energy, the energy that is more associated with psychology rather than physics, right? And this kind of energy that we consume for our psychic functions to work. So he thought at one point at least that when you expand your consciousness, it becomes very vast, but just like when you shed light with a spotlight into darkness, as you go further out, as this light beam expands or spreads out, it becomes dimmer because there's only so much energy available with so much photons available with this beam of light. So in the beginning, maybe it's very concentrated at the source, but when it spreads, it becomes very, very dim. So
Okay, so there was an interruption, unfortunately. We will have to. And meanwhile, we began to talk again about Jung and Husserl-Joly. Yeah. No, my question was, what is integral psychology, the transformation of the ego? What is the aim? Towards what is this transformation ideally pointing at?
yes, yes. I think there are different angles on this that I can use for the discussion. One is um, in the traditional yogas, where the idea was that there is a higher cosmic self that we can access through meditation and spiritual practice. Often, maybe there's different levels of it, they're not all the same, but this idea of something of a cosmic consciousness that we can experience, and then once we die, we can be in that state of consciousness. Therefore, spiritual practice was aimed at attaining this state of consciousness on a more or less permanent basis. Of course, in India, the idea of moksha or liberation was very common. In Buddhism, the idea of nirvana is very common. They're not the same idea, but basically there are these states where you are freed from ordinary consciousness and all the problems associated with life and existence, basically. So the solution generally was there's a way out of this phenomenal consciousness, and there's an absolute consciousness of sorts that we can access. So the idea of finding the way out was prominent, and therefore there was no need to really work on one's personality, right? Because what do we need it for? If I can meditate long enough, if I can attain these higher states of consciousness, and then I can just live in them as much as possible until I die, and I can be reborn in that state of consciousness, or I don't have to be born again as a human being. Therefore, I won't have to suffer again. Therefore, that would be the way out. There's no use for, my body and my personality or ego, which is the, principle of organization of this body and so on. So, but integral yoga turns this whole thing in a way upside down. I think we've talked about this before as a general discussion
Yeah.
that Sri Aurobindo had questioned the idea of why we are embodied beings. He would ask, why are we embodied beings? There must be a purpose to this, right? There must be a goal, an ontological uh, reason for this. Um, the other philosophies often would say, well, I mean, depending on what philosophy you take, but some of them would say, well, we were originally in a higher state of consciousness and we fell, the doctrine of fall of man, quote
Yeah.
unquote. And
Yeah.
so the idea that this life, just because it's full of suffering, it 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 was not quite understood that our suffering has causes, that these causes are what we need to deal with, but to get out of the suffering through the spiritual practice. So the idea was to transcend the physical body and ordinary consciousness. So, by going to this higher place and not having to be reborn, the goal would be accomplished. But Sharbina would say that doesn't make sense. We're here for a reason. There were other philosophies that might have said something like, well, we had to come down here for a certain experience, like we ultimately belong to the higher heavens, but we had to come down for a reason. And most of these justifications are not really conclusive and not really
Mm.
convincing. It seems like apologies or justifications for why we're here, right?
Yeah.
We're here because we need certain experiences, but we really don't want to be here,
Yeah.
or there have been, ideas such as, let's say, this is a stepping stone in the process of perfection of the soul, I mean, this is a little improved in the sense that it would say, our soul needs to become perfected, but this is one of the stages on the way. So, there would be a place given to the earthly experience, but only as a stepping stone. So in itself, it didn't have an intrinsic value, right? But I think the intuition that Sri Aurobindo followed and mastered was that no, there is an intrinsic value in being embodied beings. There is a reason why we're here. And of course, in his philosophy, he talks about spiritualizing this physical phenomenal existence and
Yeah.
establishing the spiritual consciousness that, of course, we are from that origin. There's no doubt about that. But the goal is not just to go back and disappear in that origin, but to bring that origin into this world and develop in this world. So the idea of changing the world, transformation of the world, and therefore, as part of that, transforming ourselves, transforming our personality on an individual basis, and collective transformation on a collective basis would be really part of this larger transformative purpose. So one way to answer your question is we need to transform because there's an end goal here,
Yeah.
and the end goal is to bring spirit down to matter and establish it in this matter. And if you recall, there's something of a sense in this idea that we shared in one of the earlier discussions that we had, that in the beginning there was, a unity of consciousness without any time and space, the so-called transcendent origin of consciousness. And then there was a polarization of this consciousness into, an extreme super consciousness and an extreme inconscient or unconsciousness, if you will. And that this uh, polarization creates the energy that is available to us. And that, the soul is an agent that comes from that origin into this process, and it descends and then it reascends back. So this is what Shobana calls the involution of consciousness, the soul's journey through these planes of, mental, vital, and physical, all the way down and then back up through a reverse process called evolution of consciousness. So that's a separate discussion, but it basically gives the overall picture of why we need to be part of this evolutionary process, and that, the world is evolving, and that we are important agents in this evolution of consciousness. And so this ties in with this idea of transformation is in the service of evolution of consciousness. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that, in a more strict psychological configuration of the same discussion, we have the outer being, which is the ego. We have the inner being, and as the soul, and we have the soul as the center of that inner being, and that these two are normally not in communication, at least in the beginning of the process, because the soul is subliminal. It's in the inner being. It's not a conscious experience for the ego. So the ego is unaware of the soul. The ego thinks of itself as a product of the evolutionary process, and therefore it's sort of the king of evolution, right? And therefore any higher principle is occult to it, is unseen to it. It doesn't recognize that, and in fact it resists it. And so I use an analogy which is a little bit funny, but if you think of remember these old taxis where you had a passenger compartment in the back and you had a driver compartment in the front with the glass window between the two, right? And the passenger, if you think of it as the soul, which is, the conscious agent that knows where it wants to go, gets in the taxi, knows where it wants to go. The driver is the ego, is the organization principle, is the instrumental principle. And it knows how to drive, it knows the city, and it doesn't have any particular purpose until the passenger comes in and says, I want to go to that X location. And therefore, a purpose is developed, and therefore that communication allows, the communication allows the purpose to be fulfilled through the instrumentation. So the ego is seen as the instrumentation, and the soul is seen as the passenger, the traveler, and the journey is evolution of consciousness. And the soul has this seed in it, which is the spark, at the core of it, which is part of that superconscious. Because if you recall, the soul descended from that higher consciousness into the lowest levels of matter. So that seed of superconsciousness is what drives the evolution upward. And that seed is like an imprint. It's like a blueprint. It has a sense of perfection that it inherits from its origin. If the Brahman, the Satchidananda, all that is beyond ordinary consciousness, is a state of perfection of sorts, then this seed that comes from that and descends into matter has a memory of that. It has a knowledge of that perfection. And this knowledge can guide the way through the evolution of consciousness. So in a way, the soul, through successive births, and that's an important assumption, but we need to look at it as an assumption rather than something that we can take for granted. It will make sense when everything else falls into place. So the journey of the soul is the journey of evolution of consciousness with this divine spark. And then through the successive births on the different planes, from the from the mineral, actually, to vegetable, to animal, to human, and so on, this soul gathers experiences, and it creates a sort of personality, it's sort of an inner personality or psychic personality, soul personality, which is something that it accumulates. And this personality is working toward perfection and knows where it needs to go next. So the assumption here is that our soul is like that passenger in the taxi, that it knows where it needs to go next, at least the next station that it needs to go. but the ego is not paying attention, is busy with its own sort of preoccupations with different physical, vital, mental desires and preoccupations in the world. And in pursuit of those, and in pursuit of maybe pleasure, in pursuit of different things, it forgets the original sort of the plan or the destiny.
Yeah.
So the idea of transformation is to make this driver, which is the instrument or the ego, become receptive to the knowledge of the soul about the destination. And so it needs to change in such a way to allow that consciousness of the soul to come forward into the front or into the conscious part of our being as much as possible, and as a gradual process, of course, until the point that it drops all of its own agendas and takes up the soul's blueprint or the
Right.
agenda of the
Yeah.
soul, which is really the true being, the true individual. So Sri Aurobindo talks about the psychic being the seat of true individuality. So that's who we really are. But this ego formation, which was necessary as part of being born into the physical world and emerging and developing as a human being, going through all those different stages of evolution. Actually, there's a interesting process as well, that from our origin as one or two cells, we develop into this being that goes through this whole magical development, so to speak, and we
Yeah.
become these human beings. But this whole principle of the ego, which guides this process up front, is not really aware of the goal of life.
Mm.
And when the ego begins to get a hint or beginning of understanding of a sense of that there's a higher purpose, as if to feel or to sense that there's something deeper in us that needs to manifest, that needs to help guide our process. That's the beginning of what we call spiritual awakening, right? The soul, the ego begins to become receptive somewhat, but the process is very complicated. In other traditions as well, I've talked about it, especially in the Sufi um, psychology. There's a very good, interesting teaching about the transformation of the ego going through various stages. It's not that simple that the ego wakes up and all of a sudden yields to the soul and everything goes well. The ego is very resistant, but then something causes it to become receptive. Now, this is interesting how that happens. Oftentimes, it's something that is not a very pleasant process. It could be, in a sense, it could be hitting rock bottom. It could be multiple failures in life. Like many people with addiction issues, they often talk about having a spiritual transformation at a moment where they hit rock bottom, and all of a sudden they woke up and they found a new purpose in life. This is all really part of that. The ego in the beginning was just in pursuit of some kind of a ordinary goal and pleasure, and then it became addicted, and then it went down into deeper and deeper, darker places until you hit this place where there's no more going down possible because you're in the sort of darkest place. And all of a sudden, the soul comes to rescue, and
Mm.
it begins to plant a new seed, and that's their process of transformation. There's a kind of a rebirth, actually, of some sort that happens. But there's also quite a different number of possibilities about how spiritual transformation becomes initiated. But the ego needs to become receptive to the soul, and the soul will become the catalyst of this transformation process. It's something that, just as in chemistry, a catalyst is, or in alchemy, a catalyst is something that does not directly engage in the chemical interaction, but it helps create the environment for the for the interaction to take
Enhances it,
place.
makes it quicker and more intense.
Yes, yes. And that's the idea of a catalyst.
Yeah.
The soul, I think, is the catalyst of the
Mm.
transformation process, you know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the goal of this transformation is to make the ego structure or the outer being receptive to the soul, which is the core of our inner being, and therefore be open to the blueprint that's available to our soul for the future of our evolutionary process. I think this kind of ties it all together in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to tie it all together, I like to insist a bit on this evolutionary perspective, because in our modern way, Western, but I think worldwide way of thinking, when you think of evolution, we think of evolution of the cells, the genetics, the body, species, animals, and Darwinian evolution.
Yes.
Here we are speaking of something that has similarities. We are transitioning from species to species, but it is more an expression of an inner evolution rather than
Mhm.
just or only physical.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people have still problems with this, because they think, what are you talking about evolution? They have this idea. Whereas when we have the psychological perspective, we usually don't think in terms of evolutionary, because there is also a difficulty of the mind. Because as you say, there's a soul, and there is the ego, and the ego doesn't listen to the soul or isn't even aware that there is a soul. But in the grand scheme, there is a higher purpose, which is that of the development of the soul. Even though the ego is not aware of the soul at the end of the story, it's all about developing the soul. And
Yes.
what, yeah, it's very difficult in our life, everyday life, especially when bad things happen that cause sufferance or that we don't like, to say, yeah, it's all for the evolution of my soul, and that's all right. Yeah? Usually we are not in this situation, even if we as people who have read about these things and know about these things, but from a psychological and mental point of view, it is difficult to accept it also intellectually, that this
Mhm.
might be possible. Even though,
Yes.
when you listen to people who have gone through for example, the typical example of those people who have survived cancer, have gone through an illness or a bad illness like cancer or whatever, and when they have gone through the tunnel, I almost every time I hear them speaking about the fact that that made them grow in some way or another. And yeah, but still, while you are going through the tunnel, it's still difficult to accept this. So I think it's important that we have this always in the background. Evolution is two-sided, is spirit and matter. There is this evolution of matter, but also of the spirit. They are not disconnected. Yeah? One
Yes.
reflects the other. It may be also go the other way around. I don't know, but and well, then when we go to higher stages of cell yoga and so on, there will be also the transformation, supramental spiritual transformation of the body. But meanwhile, we are in a situation where we have to deal, first of all, with the development and the evolution and the transformation of the ego, and
Yes.
in its triple conformation, in its triple
Formation.
aspect:
Yes.
mental ego, vital ego. Well, there is also physical ego, and that's, I think, one should devote an entire session only to that, because this connects us also to medicine, alternative medicine, spiritual approaches to medicine. because also there we have this tendency to fix our bodily issues only with chemicals, but sometimes it might be, or I would even say in most cases, it is about something that we have to deal with inwardly. But this has it has become something that in the modern way has been now accepted. There are still some who say that there is no connection between mind and body, but here we are speaking about the connection between not only mind and body, but vital and body, and yeah, ego and body, and deep down of the spirit and body, and soul and body. Especially this last step is perhaps the greatest difficulty for our culture. I know a lot of people who are very open to the spiritual things and to the spiritual ideas, but when they don't really relate to this, especially to the idea of an evolving spirit, of an evolving soul. This is something completely new, still resists in our culture. So, but if we are able to interpret our life, because you were talking about the interpretation of the dreams. Okay, I don't want to downplay this. Is certainly, if people are okay with that, everyone has one own path. I don't want to criticize, but I tried many times to interpret my, especially there are other types of dreams that are on a higher level, luminous. They make much more sense, but those dreams at the level of subconscious, it never helped me much to interpret them, because at the end I'm always stuck with this question. Okay, is this my interpretation that is just a fantasy, or is it the real interpretation? And is there an interpretation in the first place? Because I think this subconscious realm is sometimes and I'm not sure that we can interpret it always. Sometimes it's such a mechanical reactivity that there's no meaning, at least not something in this psychological sense that can help us. And whereas it helps me much more to think, okay, I don't know why this now is happening, but I accept the idea that it serves my evolution, that it is something that helps my evolution of the soul, and also the transformation of other things. However, there are two aspects here. One aspect is a bit that, because so far you were speaking about more a sort of that was not your intention, but I think the active part still does not come through really, because you say, okay, now all what happens in my life, also the worst things, ultimately serve a higher purpose and serve the evolution of my soul. Okay, but I think this is a bit a passive way of seeing things. It's true, but it's one side of the coin. But there's also the other side, that and one of the things that Sri Aurobindo said, and I think I see this over and over again, that the real exceptionality of the human being is not so much that we are able to build cars, that we build spaceships, or we ride, or all these things. Or the real power of the human being is that it can participate to this evolutionary process willingly. It's not just like if we want. So still, I would say, unfortunately, the average humanity is still in this animal modus where we just let nature do things, and we just don't have this vision. But if we are able to understand this, and it does not need, in my opinion does not mean need to have this great spiritual realization. It's also the intellectual acceptance that there is the spirit, and that all my life has this evolutionary purpose, opens the possibility to say, okay, I want to participate to this evolutionary process actively, willingly, not just let things. So then the question arises, okay, we have read these books about integral psychology, integral yoga, we know these things about, but in my everyday life, what can I do to favor this evolutionary process, spiritual process, or whatever kind of things that I have to learn and to work, and this growth. Because you speak about the transformation of the ego. Okay, but on the other side, you said changing personality turned out not to be so easy. But then we have also transformation of the mind, transformation of the vital. Let's keep out for a moment the transformation of the physical. I would say transformation of the mind and vital. Okay, what should I do now? Tell me, okay, actively, but as a human that participates willingly to this evolutionary process.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, well, there's different things that maybe come into this discussion at this point. But one of the things I would say is let's be a little bit more clear about the word evolution, because I often see it used in a kind of a misdirected way. First of all, the idea of evolution, of course, comes with Darwin, and Darwin that's 19th century, but it's also the idea of modernism, this whole new vision of humanity that came after the Renaissance. One of the main characteristic of it was that the God-centered view that was the religious view of the Middle Ages and for a long time was replaced by a human-centered view, right? In the beginning of humanism, the idea of a individual self becoming prominent as opposed to being part of this larger thing and not being very significant. So this focus on the individual sort of came up. And then in the middle of the 19th century, you have Darwin talking about evolution. And one of the ideas that also comes with modernism is the idea of progress, right? The idea that everything is moving forward toward a kind of an improvement all the time. Maybe not every step of it is an improvement, but overall there's an improvement going on in there. So I want to make sure that we separate out the idea of progress from idea of evolution, because it's one of the mistakes that a lot of people make. For example, I hear people say, our relationship evolves into this, shape, that it's so generic, it doesn't even mean progress. It means like it just moved on to, so that's really, really bad.
Just to change.
Yeah, just to change, or morphed into something or changed into something.
But this is also what you have in Darwinian evolution. They will tell you always, there's no progress, there is only change. So, yeah, I find this, there is, as always, there is a truth in that, but I don't find it, it's difficult to say what is good or bad, because also in Sri Aurobindo, you have this classification, higher and lower, divine, undivine. He also uses the words, this is perversion. If you look, very often he uses the word perversion. And the modern, analytic, Western-centered mind will tell you, no, there is no higher, no lower, no better, no worse. Evolution is not evolution of progress. It's just a change, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah, there
that's
are truths. There's something true in this, yeah, because also our notions of what is good and bad, yeah, are culturally determined by our culture, by our opinions, by our ideologies, by our religion, whatever. So, and it is difficult to define what is higher and lower. And yet, I'm not convinced that this just about change and nothing else. There
yeah.
must be more, no?
Yeah, I think we should move away from the idea of just change, evolution meaning just change.
Yeah.
Also, evolution meaning progress is not always uh, correct.
Mm.
Uh, Also, the idea that all biological things are evolving, I think that's something that needs clarification.
Mm.
Because uh, in integral yoga, evolution is seen as a particular line of development of consciousness. It's not everything, and not everything is evolving. In fact, in the cosmology of Sri Aurobindo, you have beings that are not
Yeah,
evolving,
yeah.
right? We have
The
beings at
overmind,
higher
the God,
levels.
yeah.
Yeah, like yeah, higher levels, those beings that are not evolving. In fact, some of them are antagonistic to the idea of evolution of consciousness, right? Um, then also on a lower level, we have like for example, it's doubtful that you can say that mosquitoes evolve, or I can see, for example, people use the coronavirus, evolved into this new version,
Yeah.
I mean, these are all
Not the
wrong,
progress,
wrong
not
usage of the word,
better. Yeah, yeah.
used by professionals, as if coronavirus is intentionally trying to improve itself and evolve, and therefore created a new version of itself. The idea of evolution is something that is a particular act of the divine that has a particular line of development that we as human beings are part of that process. And it has to do with the evolution of the soul. Not all beings have a soul, but any being that is part of the evolutionary process has a soul. So, in a sense, vegetables and animals and human beings, they all carry the soul, except that the level of experience, the psychic personality, as if to say, that surrounds the soul is very different from one level to the other. And also within all animals or within all human beings, it's very different. So we have the idea of the evolution of soul, which I think is closer to the idea of evolution of consciousness. And we also have the idea of individual evolution versus collective evolution, which I think Darwinian um, biology normally talks about collective evolution of form.
Yeah.
It's
Evolution form.
and whether people see, you see, the positivism is such a strong dominant influence. Anything that had to do had something to do with metaphysics had to be ruled out and set aside. That you have to say that everything is evolving, these new forms are changing, but you can't say that it's going somewhere. There is no teleology. Teleology must be something religious.
That's a problem in integral psychology, I would say. Because this, if you are minded like a positivist, well, no, of course, a positivist wouldn't be interested in integral psychology in the first place. But let's say people who come from that kind of environment and from that kind of culture, but are open-minded and are have interest in these spiritual uh, um, topics and integral yoga, integral psychology, and so on, and metaphysics. Uh, I saw this over and over again, that there is really this resistance because how can you speak about a transformation that you want to actively participate in this transformation
Mhm.
if you don't perceive the goal of this transformation anything better than what you are now? Then what's the
Yes.
point? If it's all the same or all something different, but we should not add to it some extra value, my intention to practice this yoga or this integral, how do you call it, clinical approach or whatever, makes no sense, at least from the logic. Then I said, why should be interested in involved? So there must be a qualitative difference, not just quantitative or just inessential qualitative difference between these two levels, because there is now I'm Marco Masi, I'm the guy who is as he is, and now I want to participate in this evolutionary process, but I have somehow an understanding to become better in some way, even though I will never find a perfect definition of what is meant by better. If this is not accepted, that there must be some qualitative difference, I don't think that we can begin with a transformation in the sense meant by Sri Aurobindo.
Yes, yes. I think, well, first of all, I would say all these things that you were just saying, I would attribute that to ego activities, The ego would think that way, because it doesn't see a point in transformation. Now, the idea of improvement, that's a little different.
Improvement is already a very dangerous word, because there's no improvement. Because also improvement is a qualitative understanding of change. No?
Yes, I think in the developmental process, in the beginning, as we've discussed before, in the first few years of life, the ego formation is not really quite there yet. It's not solidified. By the age of 7, let's say, we have a fairly good, relatively good age that you have some sort of ego, because the verbal function has attained some degree of mastery, and people can think in terms of narratives and episodic memory, that where you can remember stories and narratives, and therefore stories about yourself, stories about your family, stories about your anything, and these stories that we tell in ourselves, these are stories that our ego basically tells us, and these stories, in the first few years of life, there's a lot of room for improvement in these stories, because there's no formation yet. It's not crystallized, All children are eager to know and to grow, and but somehow, ages 10, 11, 12, 15, even though there are periods in life where the identity formation is negotiable, but there becomes a crystallization and a sense that, okay, this is who I am, because you need to sort of give shape to the story. You need to settle on something. You have to say, okay, this is who I am. This is me, And if you are very, very healthy for some reason, let's say good biological and sociological and cultural conditions, good parenting and good education, there may be a way that your ego development is very vulnerable, in the sense of allowing the soul to influence it on a normal, sort of natural basis. And so the idea of constantly improving would be something that will stay with us. But with many people, there seems to be, and this is where we get into unhealthy ego development, where the ego begins to feel a need to say that, okay, this is it, I've reached it, now I know. Or, like ego can function in these silent ways by saying things like, okay, I know now, or I know more than you do, or I'm right and you're wrong. Like when we interact with people, there's this tendency to say that I know, And so I've seen that in small children, actually. There's an age where, sometimes around 4 or 5, where they kind of say, like anything you tell them, they say, I know. Like,
Yeah.
how do you know? You know, you're only 4 years old, but I know, you know. And but this is the stamp of ahankara, you know, the ahan meaning the ego and activities of the ego, where it kind of puts a seal on things and says, okay, now I know, you know, and then this idea of pride and it becomes often a process that conceals our imperfections and psychological imperfections and things of that sort, you know, things that we lack in our life. So self-structure, you know, when the self-structure is not developing very healthy for various reasons, that's a long discussion. But when that happens, often the ego comes in, you know, and this is where narcissistic often begins. You know, you have an unhealthy self-structure. You don't, for example, you don't have, as a child, you don't have good parents to tell you enough about how good you are and how loved you are and how valuable you are as a human being. You don't get this kind of feedback. They're often criticizing you. Anything you do wrong, they come down at you. Or sometimes when you have interesting ideas, they're ignored or not encouraged. And so the child doesn't get a good sense of who I am and has to invent, you know, a sense of, which is typically an aggrandized, you know, a sort of
Uh,
exaggerated sense of, you know, in a kind of a almost a fantasy-like, you know, that I am this champion, I am this
yeah.
hero, I am this, you know, higher being. I don't accept what they're telling me. I am great, you know, and so this narcissism develops, but it becomes a cover for the wounding that's underneath it, you know. So this is called narcissistic wounding.
Mm.
So often narcissistic people are not very pleasant to interact with because they always have a sense of self-importance and they always have to be in the front and center of attention and talk about themselves. And so who likes that, you know? But what we often tend to not to see is the wounding that's underneath it. It's almost like a balloon that you can pierce, you know, with a little, you know, pin. You can burst the whole thing. It's, you know, that's how fragile the whole thing is. But the pretense is that, oh, I'm great, you know, and I can do anything, I can take anything. I'm better than everyone and all that. You know, so I think, you know, what we have is this ego development that becomes fragile and unhealthy, and then it resorts to creation of this false self, you know, these things that are not our true authentic self, you know. And so, you know, there's a wide um, array of possibilities among different human beings, you know, in terms
Yeah.
of psychological development, you know. But some people do have a strong sense of self. You know, I would say those are the ones who have already a developed or highly evolved ego. And this is where I'm talking about individual evolution, right? On a personal level, on the trajectory of personal evolution, the person has acquired a lot of wisdom, let's say, in a way that has stayed with them from life to life and has grown in that way. So you can maybe call it progress or you can call it wisdom or whatever you want. That sometimes a child is born with that kind of entity, and there's so much self-reward and self-consciousness that comes with the child like that, that all these images and messages that come from the outside are not very effective. You know, they can fight it off, you know, like they don't believe all these things that they're hearing. They think people are, you know, they don't know what they're talking about. I know what I'm talking about, you know, but in a more realistic sense, you know, some deeper wisdom or deeper sense of self, some intuition that tells them what's right, what's wrong, and how to go forward in life, you know. So I think there's that great, you know, difference between individuals. So I think we should overcome the idea of evolution as just change or progress, and that kind of thing. And we need to think of evolution of consciousness as stages of uh, the development of soul, you know,
Mm.
and these stages may not be mappable, uh, or may be mappable, you know, that's possible. You can bring in your mental functioning and give it some map or shape or talk about it in certain ways. And some people have done that. But there are just different stages that only the soul knows what the next stage is, what's the next step of the process is. So as soon as the soul is allowed to interfere and be the catalyst, this transformation happens. And as we said before, it's easier to transform the mind because the mind is of a higher frequency and it's much more malleable, rather than the vital, which is, a lower, a mid-range frequency. And when it comes to the physical, it becomes more dense. So, the more you come down, the harder the process of transformation. But I don't think that we need to come up with theories about what transformation should look like. I think that's a
No,
very individual process. And I think
we
a
cannot,
very,
absolutely.
a
Because
very key thing for an integral yoga person is to conceive of their own vision of what the next stage of the process is for them and be able to work with that and do what's right in order to get to where they believe they need to
yeah,
go.
yeah. Every time we try to imagine what is coming next, it never works. No, but this is not the point. But I think that at least if someone who would like to follow a path of integral psychology, uh, and which is more or less directly linked to the teachings of Sri Aurobindo, it is difficult not to say that it is a path from the unconscious to the conscious, from undivine to the divine. So the aim, the ultimate game, yeah, it's also a game, but the ultimate aim is that to divinize us, to make a little, even though if we are only humans and we cannot become divine immediately, but make a step towards the divine
Yes,
consciousness, which,
exactly.
yeah, but there is a contrast, and we have to, because I also very often, what I hear, and I don't know what you think about that, but in the Western psychology, we always hear this thing. I don't know how to rephrase this now in rephrasing it in my words. That our instincts, our fears, our anger, our all these what Sri Aurobindo would call the lower vital movements. We should give them all the place they need. We should express them without boundaries. We should give them all the life and all the energy that it needs, because if we repress them, this makes things worse. Yeah. So this thing is true. Yeah, repressing these movements, because you see, it is a fact in the Aurobindonian mind map, so to speak. We have this categorization between lower vital and higher vital. Lower mind, higher mind. The unconscious physical and aspects of us in the physical, vital, and mental, which are more conscious. And there is also this, these are words, of course, but there's the dark side and the side of light. So I think one resistance that I see is this idea, well, to express this now in the terminology of integral yoga, we have to give freedom to our lower vital instincts. That's deeply rooted in the Western psychology. Also, I would say in the spiritual environment. I mean, I'm not a follower of any school or whatever, but I read or on YouTube you can see a lot of these spiritual supposedly enlightened people, or also in non-duality or whatever, there is always this central theme. Yeah, okay, we should not repress our things, but should we really? There is a dissonance between what I hear in these kind of spiritual environments and what Sri Aurobindo is saying. So how does this transformation take place if we want to participate to it actively? And how do we and how do we manage these lower instincts? Here again, I lose this. But there is no lower, no higher. They are just instincts. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But if I have the aim to spiritualize me and to get closer to the divine, there is a choice to make. I have to go in that direction or that direction. Cannot be both. And yeah, when it comes to make things practical, yeah, that's why I thought a bit about the practice. Yeah? In my everyday life, I have, I don't know, this explosions of anger. What does the integral psychologist say? What should be our attitude there? To repress it, to give it a free pass to do everything, or what?
Yeah. Yeah. Or something in between, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, let's see.
Well, I think you're right in a general sense that, well, in the, of course, with Freud and psychoanalysis, the idea of repression came in, and often people think of repression as a bad thing, but also we need to think of it as a good thing because repression, like other defense mechanisms, have a function. For example, Freud himself, he discovered, for example, that certain young women who were sexually abused would not remember, and suppress or repress all the memories associated with that. And it would then turn to hysteria, which would manifest in a different way. And so he started to kind of look into this and he started to, figure this out for himself. So the idea of bringing things out of the unconscious into the light of consciousness as a general principle may be acceptable, except how you do that and when you do that and the extent to which you do that and all of those things are the most important aspects. It's not a on or off switch. It's not like you keep stuff in the unconscious or you bring stuff out of the unconscious. It's a skillful process by which you have to, whether it's a psychotherapist or someone who's working with as a counselor or even working on oneself, we have to have discretion in terms of how to work with all of that. So I don't think there's a general formula in this, but I would say the answer is somewhere in between. And I would use the analogy of, let's say you're, on a mountainside and there's a huge cave with a big opening, and then you go inside this cave and it becomes tighter and deeper and darker as you go in. In the beginning, when you enter this cave, you can get some sunlight coming through so you can see. As you go deeper, it gets darker, and then eventually it comes a point where there's just no more light and it gets very deep. If you want to travel all the way down, if this is the cave of analogy of the unconscious, you have to bring with yourself the lighting equipment that's appropriate for the depth that you're going into. That's I would say is the most important thing. If you're going to go a little bit into the cave, maybe a flashlight would be good. But if you're going way in, you need to really have the preparation and the tools for going down there. So this applies to being a psychotherapist or just working on oneself, or sometimes people take psychedelics and things like that, and then they just opens up a whole bunch of things. I think for the most part, the idea that you have to leave things out of the unconscious and bring it out into the open is not a wise general advice. I would say there has to be discretion in terms of how much and why you would bring something out. If it's understood that, for example, something is keeping you from growing, and if there's a memory of some event that you've been suppressing because of trauma or other things, it may be useful to work very carefully and through stages of working with that to a point where you can kind of recall this event and work with it, and then allow yourself to move forward. But if there's something that's not necessary to go into, it doesn't help anything else. There's no need to go into it, you know. So I think a lot of discretion is really important here. In the 1960s, I think with the rise of the hippie movement and then with the emergence of new psychologies like Gestalt therapy and different methods that people were inventing left and right during those times, there was a period of, yeah, and there was also the sexual revolution. Now, there was a period of a free for all kind of thing. Let's just like bring this out. Let's just, you know, experiment with this or with that. And I think for the most part, those things have not been fruitful. It's really something of a question of a lot of different variables and the extent to which you work. So to go down to the unconscious, you have to work first on the equipment that you need, and you have to have the right light of consciousness to go to the depths of the unconscious. If you don't have that light, it's very unsafe and it's not advisable, you know.
Yeah. In fact, and to have this light means, at least in part, or the central light of all is the psychic being, isn't it? And so
Yes.
let's perhaps conclude for today about this psychic transformation, because we were speaking about the ego, transformation of the ego, transformation of the vital, of the mind, etc. But the psychic transformation, what is this about?
Yes.
I mean, this is I know, but I'm just, and how do we connect it to the other transformations? Yeah.
Yes. I think we covered that in a way without calling it psychic transformation, but
Yeah.
psychic transformation does not mean the transformation of the psyche or of the soul itself. It means the transformation of the outer personality with the facilitation of the soul by the
Yeah,
soul.
so you have this light in the cave, isn't it? Is it seeing you according to your metaphor, that's why it came to my mind, is that this light in the cave is primarily, I think, the psychic.
Yeah, could be that exactly. It's a place of consciousness, of a certain type of consciousness, psychic consciousness, that can help us look at the contents of our both consciousness and subconscious, you know, whatever it is that we want to work with. So the idea would be to uh, open ourselves to to the psychic consciousness, to access the psychic being, and to know what it is, at least intuitively in the beginning, and then more and more directly through practices that allow us to get in touch with it. And then allowing that point of observation, which is the psychic eye, let's say, or being able to see from that center of consciousness who we are on the outer consciousness. You know, ordinarily, the ego is not able to see itself very well. And this is exactly because of defense mechanisms. You know, the ego sees what it wants to see, and it's, you know, defends itself against unwanted things. So that's why, you know, the ego and the unconscious and all this suppressed material, all of that, you know, makes up the psychodynamics in a sense, that the ego functions to show you only what it wants to show you, and hides from you what is not sweet or things that are difficult. But the ego is also judgmental, and it doesn't have a very deep and clear vision. it's distorted, so it's not a very good place to observe yourself from. So the idea is to shift to a psychic consciousness and to observe the external ego from that psychic consciousness. And I think in some sense, if that's done properly, meaning as a witness consciousness without attachment, without any kind of judgment, the very act of bringing this consciousness is already transformative, you know. Like I said, it's the catalyst. It's the catalyst, it's the catalysm that the psychic consciousness brings naturally, you know. So all we have to do is to sort of step out of our ego consciousness as much as possible. And a lot of meditations actually help you do that. Sri Aurobindo's idea of introspection, for example, or different methods of witness consciousness meditation are basically methods for this. You know, you step out, you know, it takes time to develop concentration and to find a place from which you can observe. But eventually, this process becomes more and more possible and you get better at it. And then once we get very good at it, you know, we can see the nature of our outer being. We can see it with, in a sense, with love, with compassion. You know, we can forgive ourselves for, you know, any
Yeah.
mistakes we might make, for any imperfections we might have, you know, and we are able to actually visualize how we can grow. You know, that's not something that the ego is able to do, because the ego would rather pretend that I'm already fine. I'm doing great. I mean, how
Yeah.
many people do I know in my life that are, you know, in this kind of narcissistic trap where they don't want to hear anything. They don't want you to tell them anything. They don't want to be criticized. They see everything as a criticism because there's this vibration that's a defense mechanism that says, I already know. I'm fine. I'm fine. You know, if I want to improve, I'll do it in my own terms. You know, don't tell me what to do. And so, you know, all this defensiveness doesn't allow you to, you know, to really see the reality. But if you see it from a more of a psychic, it's almost like a, you know, it's a metaphor, but it's almost like a parent-child relationship, you know, where the parent, you know, sees the imperfections of a child, but it can love the child, it can be patient with the child, it can help provide what is
Yeah.
needed for growth and development and for transformation, you know. So this process is usually gradual, but sometimes it can also happen very, very quickly. So this is what Sri Aurobindo calls psychic transformation, the transformation of personality or the ego, or ego-based personality, otherwise outer personality, through the psychic being, through the psychic consciousness. So it's this transformation of ego by the psyche through the influence of the psyche. And Sri Aurobindo basically has said that this is the method for most people. There's also another method called spiritual transformation, and that I would take to be the method of a direct influence by the higher levels of consciousness. But that requires a very well-developed, healthy ego development to begin with, you know, because if that's not there, that's not going to be possible. And I usually think of spiritual transformation as something that happens to like prophets, you know. You read the story of certain prophets, you know, and you see that they were normal human beings in some sense in the beginning, and all of a sudden these things happen and they're given a mission. All of a sudden they find themselves to have a divine mission. Often those people, if you study their personality as a before transformation, they're usually wise or just somebody very good-natured or wise, and already able to receive the spiritual energy. But for most of us, we need to do some psychological work and psychic transformation to prepare the ego for the descent of a higher level of consciousness. So
Yes, but
that's two approaches.
I think also for the psychic opening, there must be first also a transformation of the ego or of the different parts in one way or another, because the psychic transformation, I mean, in a sense, perhaps a bit, as we already said, the soul, the psychic, always works in the background. There is always some intimation on one form or another. But if it wants to get to the front, can't get to the front without at least a part, in part, and already a transformation that has already taken place on a vital level, mental level, and now physical level might not be necessary, but mental level and vital level, I think, and the ego, I think part of the transformation must have already be realized, then the psychic can come into the front.
Yes, yes. I think the idea of receptivity is that same idea of spiritual awakening, and as I mentioned to you before, spiritual awakening often, if you listen to the various stories that people share, it's hardly a nice and cut and dried process, and in
Yeah.
fact, someone's egoic life is going well in a sense. If they're successful in worldly ways, there may be even a lesser chance because, when the ego is successful, it continues to do what it does and it's rewarded for what it does, and it has any reason to question anything. Oftentimes things happen because there are failures in life or there's alienation in life. Sometimes actually, there's a longer process where you feel, well, everything is going well, but I'm not really happy deep inside. Why,
Yeah.
Or it could be that from the very early age, one can begin the process of asking the question, who am I? Just to be curious, on a mental level and want to open up and be open to new ideas and read about spiritual philosophies and different things. So there's actually many, many different stories. I remember there were so many Sufi stories about how, different stories of transformation of different people. And it's almost things like this. I'll tell you one of the stories, which is kind of interesting. There was this very famous Sufi philosopher who was actually a professor at Baghdad, university in Baghdad. And he becomes influenced by Sufism, and he knew Islamic philosophy and was a scholar. But he finally decides that this university is not the place for him because everybody's, too academic and they're not open to the Sufi influences that he was opening to. And he tries, he begins to travel to Damascus to pursue a different path. And along the way gets robbed, their caravan gets robbed by these robbers. And so, when the robbers attack them, they ask for gold. And, this guy basically, takes out all the gold coins or whatever he had and gives it to the chief bandit and says, here, take my gold, but don't mess with my books. He had maybe some books with him in a caravan. And this thief, the chief of the thieves, would say, wait a minute, this is really curious. Like when we rob people, they often try to hide their money or they eat their coins or, you're giving me
What you
this
have in your
and you
book.
say, don't touch with my books, don't mess with my books. What's in those books? He says, well, everything I know is in these books. So this guy actually begins to laugh really loud at him. And he, after he's done laughing, he says, let me tell you one thing. If what you know can be stolen from you, you know nothing.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, so this is the story of the transformation of this theologian who knew so much, who had these books, who had probably, like someone in today's life where they knew so much about spirituality and religion and theology and everything, but they hadn't quite they needed that touch, that to somebody to tell them that throw away all these books. This is not the real path of knowledge. So, there are stories, many stories like this of transformation. So the opening can happen all of a sudden, like
Yeah,
I agree with you, there has to be some opening, but sometimes the opening is like a seismic crack, it's like a
yeah.
seismic pressure that builds up that eventually, something happens. in the stories, as I mentioned to you at some point, um, I worked with hundreds and hundreds of counseling psychology students, and we explored the past lives, their lives before they became a psychologist and the process of their transformation. And almost entirely, I mean, almost 99% of them would tell of very difficult childhoods, very difficult psychological upbringing and challenges that eventually the sense of unhappiness and then seeing a therapist and getting some help and then wanting to be on the other side after they started their healing process. So the idea of healing and transformation are also intimately connected. Transformation is not just
Absolutely, yeah.
some mechanical
Healing,
process.
yeah.
Yeah.
Transformation is a form of healing.
Yes.
I would suggest to meet again and go deeper about this, because I would like to see also next time somehow if you can think perhaps of some, not personal, but if you wish, also personal examples, but personal in the general sense of other people, how some approaches, some attitudes, some ways of practicing this integral yoga or integral psychology has transformed people.
Mhm.
What they have done in their life to go through this transformation. Because as we said, you can have this psychic opening suddenly, and a lot of people have this psychic opening and have no idea what it is. No, they don't know nothing about the things we are talking about. But as I said, as human beings, we have this great power that we can participate in this evolutionary process actively and accelerating it. It would be nice to see what, because I would like to deepen this. We already discussed this a bit now, but yeah, and this integration of personality and wholeness. Yeah. What
Yes.
does it
Yes.
mean to integrate the personality with what?
Yeah, I think that's a very good topic because I think it deserves its own time. And
Mm,
I would just say that to cap what I mentioned today, this idea of evolution of the soul, that this process from a psychological point of view, I've found it very useful to use two different metaphors for this. And there's actually a number of other metaphors possible, but the metaphor of a journey from unconsciousness to consciousness and then beyond to super consciousness. I think that's one way that we can
mm,
describe the journey of the soul, because the soul emerges from the lowest depths of the inconscient and emerges and evolves toward higher and higher levels of light and consciousness. Another one is this idea of a journey from fragmentation to wholeness. That's another one that we could tackle next time because it comes with this idea of integration of personality. What does it mean I mean, transformation is one thing, is one idea, but also personality is more complex than just the triple ego, right? There are different aspects of personality that need to come together. And in integral psychology, there may be ways of talking about that. So transformation and integration of personality is a really
mm.
well-deserved topic. And to also think about the goal of integral psychology is to experience wholeness of personality. I
Yeah,
think that,
exactly. What does it
yes,
mean really, this
yes,
wholeness of
a
personality?
sense of wholeness and
Yeah.
what does that really mean? And what's the difference between that and perfection, for example? So yeah, very nice. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Marco.
Thank
We'll
you, Bahman. Thank
look
you
forward to the
for
next one.
your wise words and insights. And let's see then next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
I'll be in touch with you.